Okay, this is the second in the series of material I'm posting online for people who have missed class due to COVID restrictions. And let me get the slides back up here. There we go. Excuse me. Everything seems to be where it needs to be. This is a short section on culture. All right, so this is not the methods lecture, but it's what I use to start off the methods section of the course. Excuse me. Methods is scheduled technically from the first half of week 1 to the end of week 2. We're into week 3, and we just finished it up last class on Monday. Monday would have been the 13th. All right, so going into today's class, I'm recording this on September 15th. We're going to be beginning biology. Excuse me. So we're going to talk about biological anthropology, specifically human origins, today in class. This is from 3 classes ago. All right, so again, this is just part of that lecture. So the methodology stuff is still to come. I'll post that whenever I am able to get it recorded. Excuse me, this is relatively short, so we should be able to get through it all right. Studying culture. I included a specific section on culture because pretty much every introductory anthropology textbook has a chapter on culture. And if you look in the Kotak text, you'll find that there is a chapter on culture. If you look at even the table of contents for that, you'll see that some of the things I'm going to talk about are listed out in there. I think there are a couple of variable categories that Kotak has added, but that's usual. You know, pretty much all those intro textbooks, they all have a chapter on culture, and they all have the basic sort of 5 things, 5 different aspects of culture. And that's what we're going to talk about in here. But usually they add in 1 or 2 of their own just to be unique, I guess. And everybody has their own research interests, so they add in what makes sense for them. All right, so if you look in those chapters, what you'll find is a list like this. Learned, shared, symbolic, adaptive, integrated, a bunch of adjectives. Those 5 categories, 5 adjectives, are represent different aspects of culture. We're going to go through each one and make sure everybody understands what they mean. If you want further explanation, look in the textbook. I'm sure Kotak goes into great detail on that. When we say that culture is learned, what we mean is that it's not something that's biologically ingrained in us. The capacity for culture is biologically ingrained. Any given culture, the details of any culture, that stuff we learn. And we learn it from other people in our culture. So we learn it from our parents, we learn it from our teachers, people we're supposed to learn from, but we also learn it from our peers, people who are sort of on the same level as us. Pretty much everybody we run into on a day-to-day basis in our own culture, from the time we're born till the time we die, is teaching us our culture. So culture is learned. It's not something that is biologically ingrained in you. All right. We have an innate capacity to learn culture, but we have to learn the details of a culture. So if you take a baby from Saudi Arabia and you move that baby to China, and the child is raised in China with Chinese traditions, Chinese language, and all that, the kid's going to grow up like any other Chinese person learning their culture. We'll have no trace of any kind of Arabic culture that you might associate with the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. Right? We don't carry that with us biologically. It's something we learn from other people. So that's what the learned part means. Shared, it's easy to get kind of mixed up with learned because there's a degree of overlap, but they use them as distinct terms for a reason, because they're using shared differently than they're using learned. Learned means you acquire it from other people. Shared means we have it in common with other people. And again, for some people listening to this, it might sound like those are kind of the same. They're not. We acquire the culture, that's the learned part, from other people. But we also have it in common. We can think of this in terms of language. Language is a close analogy to culture in terms of how the brain works. In a language, we all have a shared vocabulary. We have a shared set of rules, a grammar of a language, and that allows us to communicate with each other. If you ever spoke to somebody who speaks a different language, they understand a whole different set of rules for another language, and so when we speak to each other, we're operating by different rules, and we don't have those in common. So the rules are not shared, in other words. Culture works the same way. Right, the brain doesn't really distinguish between those processes in the same way that we do. We draw a hard line between them. It's not really a hard line. The brain just functions the way it does. So when we say culture is shared, we mean that we have it in common with other people in our own culture. Right? We all know we're going to stop at the stoplight because it's red, and everybody stops there. Pretty much, if somebody doesn't, they broke a rule, right? We know we stop at a stop sign. We don't just stay forever. You don't just stop and never go again. You stop, you check to make sure nobody else is coming, and then you can go. All right? Well, these are rules that we have in common. If we didn't, we'd have car crashes all the time. We'd also have miscommunications all the time, and nothing would function at all. So we share the rules and the norms, values, and rules of our culture. All right, I would say culture is symbolic. This is something that was added into the list because there were a large number of people who studied symbolic anthropology for a long period of time. That was formed sort of its own subfield, not one of the 4 subfields, but a sub-subfield, right? So David Kurtzer comes to mind. There were a lot of people who really focused on the symbolic elements of culture, and so that was put in. And symbolic culture is symbolic in a lot of ways, so it makes sense. We use symbols all the time. So what's a definition of a symbol? It's a thing that represents another thing. All right, so we'll talk about one thing and use it to represent something else. We use symbolic reasoning in culture all the time. Right? There are many elements of culture that are symbolic, so it makes sense that a subfield would have grown out of that. That's why it's included in the list. Culture is adaptive. This means that it's adaptive to social circumstances, but more importantly, maybe it's adaptive to ecological circumstances. Now, in here, I drew a distinction in class between biological adaptation and cultural adaptation. Right, biological adaptation is slow. Right, think about evolution. Polar bears evolved to live in a very cold environment. They got dark skin underneath light fur, which reflects the sun rays, but the dark skin absorbs it, and they can blend into their environment because of the light-colored fur while still having the dark skin and absorbing sunlight to heat up. They have a bunch of cold adaptations. Those are biological adaptations, which took generations upon generations to develop. Right? Humans are capable of something called cultural adaptation, which means we change our behavior. We don't necessarily have to wait for biology to change. Right? So if we go outside and it's too cold, we don't sit around and wait to grow fur. We put a coat on. We developed clothing and controlled use of fire and shelter that allowed us to move into different environments. We're capable of cultural adaptation. We can change not only the way we individually act, but how our entire group acts, and make quick adaptations to environments, right, which has allowed people to be very successful over a long period of time through many different climatic changes throughout human prehistory. Right. Culture is adaptive. It's one of the greatest tools that we have. It sets us apart from other animals. More on that in a second here when we get to the standard definition that I'm going to give you for culture. But yeah, cultural adaptation is enormous in terms of being able to adapt to different environments. Other animals don't even come close to competing because of cultural adaptation, which is distinct from, again, biological adaptation, which is really slow based on evolution. Cultural adaptation can happen instantaneously. Culture is integrated. This has to do with the holism that I described in the on the first day of class and in the first video that I posted. I remember holism was looking at something as a whole, not just looking at the constituent parts. The idea is that those constituent parts, the parts that make something up, are integrated with one another. That's what this integrated is for. Right? So once again, if we look at the economy and religion and family structure and all those things and language, and we can analyze each one of them individually, but we have to bear in mind that they are all integrated with every other part. So if you change something in the language, it may have an effect on the religion, which may have an effect on the social structure. So all the different parts of culture are integrated with one another. I threw the etc. in there just to indicate that people add something else in there almost all the time when they write a textbook. So these are the core 5, the ones that you always see. So in terms of a definition for culture, we're going to go with the first 2. So if I ask you what culture is, you're looking for a definition. Culture is shared, learned behavior. And we just described what learned meant. We just described what shared meant. All right, so culture is shared, learned behavior. And the reason for that is that it comes back to those 4 subfields. If we only had cultural anthropologists, or if we had cultural anthropologists and linguists, or even if we had cultural anthropologists, linguists, and archaeologists, they would all be okay with a complex definition of culture that you had to spend a lot of time hashing out every time you use it. Biological anthropologists were excluded by complex definitions of culture. Think of the primatologists. We talked about them being of interest because of human origins. It's very useful to be able to talk about culture in the context of chimpanzees. You can't do that if we're talking about symbolic behavior, Adaptive behavior, you could probably make an argument. Integrated, now there aren't all these different elements that are integrated in the same way as in human cultures, but we can say that there's learned behavior. We know that chimpanzees are born and they learn how to do certain things like tool use, for example. There are a couple of different documented sorts of tool use among great apes, specifically chimpanzees, maybe with other ones as well, I'm not sure. Termite fishing is one. You take a branch, you strip all the leaves off it, like a little twig, and you jam it into an ant hill or a termite hill, and it comes out covered with termites because they all attack the thing, and then they just eat the termites off of the thing. They eat it as a fairly nutritious thing to eat if you don't mind eating termites, right? Which chimpanzees don't. All right. Yeah, so they can learn that behavior from other members of the group. Some groups don't do termite fishing. Other ones do, and when they do, they teach it to their offspring. Right, so it's a learned behavior. Shared behavior, they all can understand what other chimpanzees are doing. Somebody's stripping leaves off the branch, and well, it's time to strip leaves off the branches so we can go termite fishing. That's a shared behavior. They all know how to do it. They recognize the behavior in others, and so they join in because it's time to do that. There's a big termite mound, right? Okay, so culture is shared learned behavior, and we defined it in the simplest way, given the background we just discussed, because it includes the primatologists as well, and other biological anthropologists, maybe studying pre-human states. All right, moving on from that. One of the major points in going through this, and the reason all the intro texts do it, is because the definition of specific technical terms often depends on one's analytical goals, right? And that's illustrated by what I was just explaining. Right? Biological anthropologists, they can do very well with a simple definition of culture. Cultural anthropologists, they may focus heavily on symbolic aspects, so they may sort of tune their definition of culture to that aspect of it. And when people are doing work, they always do kind of come up with their own idiosyncratic definition based on what they're trying to study. So this is a lot of sort of background to interpreting those when you encounter them in text, which you eventually will if you continue to read anthropology. All right, here are a couple of terms that have to do with how people acquire culture, and enculturation and acculturation. Enculturation refers to the process by which we learn our native culture. All right, everyone has a native culture. It's possible to have more than one. We'll explain how that happens in a second here. But enculturation is a process that happens while we're children. Acculturation is a process of learning a foreign culture, which is an adult experience. It happens when you're grown and you go out and experience foreign culture and try to understand how it works. Now, enculturation is a lot easier. You don't ever think about it. It just happens. And that's because children's brains function differently from adult brains. If anybody's ever heard of the critical period for language acquisition, this is a closely related process. Right. When you're within the critical period for language acquisition, your brain is a sponge. You're absorbing all kinds of information. Where language is concerned, you're absorbing the details of the language that you're going to speak. It's going to be your native language. If you're exposed to more than one language during that time, you can learn them both to native proficiency without really studying for 2 minutes. You don't have to crack a book ever. You just learn by exposure. Now, as you grow up, and this is from basically birth until puberty, are the absolute boundaries of the critical period. We'll talk more about that when we get to linguistics. We're going to spend some time on that. So basically, at birth, you're absorbing, right? And the critical period shuts off in stages throughout. And the last shut off is at puberty. At puberty, you're absolutely out of the critical period. Before that, there still may be elements of it that are active, right? So it's important to understand developmentally that our brains function differently as children. We absorb our culture in addition to our language in a way that's going to make it seem natural to us throughout our entire lives because it's what we absorb as children. It's ingrained in us from that point. Not that we didn't have to learn it; it's not biological, but the capacity to integrate it is biological. Like we have the capacity to learn culture because of our biology, but we have to learn the actual culture from people around us. Right, we already covered that in the first part, the introductory part of these lectures. So, enculturation, something that happens to you as a child because your brain's functioning differently. You learn your native culture, the one that's going to seem natural to you throughout your life. Acculturation is what happens when you're past that critical period. You're an adult. Your brain is experiencing things like an adult and has sort of reallocated resources to other things than absorbing culture and language. right? So you may not learn a foreign culture to the same degree of proficiency that you learned your cultures of enculturation. And so even if you migrate to another place, you may learn aspects of their culture, and you may learn just enough to survive. You may learn more than that. You may learn to almost native proficiency. Most likely, you probably won't get to full native. I mean, people will never look at you and say, you're the same as people who are born here. And that's not because they have some prejudice or anything like that. It's because it's going to be true in terms of how your brain processes things. Right? Your enculturation was in another culture, so you're thinking through, you're filtering our culture through another cultural lens. And that's something that's just an underlying fact of how these things work. All right, so there's a difference between enculturation and acculturation. Culture change. Some of these are terms that you're going to see when we go through some of the readings, and so I've included them. They all have to do with culture and how we talk about culture. This has to do with how cultures change, not how previous set had to do with how cultures are acquired. This has to do with how cultures change. There's the idea of an independent innovation. When somebody has a new idea which spreads and becomes normalized within a culture, right, which is comparatively rare in relation to diffusion of innovation, which is what happens when somebody borrows an idea from another culture. So someone sees a practice that's going on in another culture and says, hey, that might work, and starts doing it in their own culture. Other people sort of catches on with other people and becomes a cultural norm in more than one culture. Right? That would be diffusion of innovation. For example, lots of people in the 19th century spent time analyzing potsherds, P-O-T-S-H-E-R-D-S, which is made up of the terms pot and shard, like a broken piece of a pot. So potsherds, that's a term they use in archaeology all the time. And throughout the 19th century, people had a great deal of focus on potsherds. And what they were trying to do was create these typologies, so you can see all the different types of pottery that were made in a place, and often you'd see diffusion of a type of pottery from one place to another. You'd see it was showing up here in the 1800s or the early 1800s, and then by the 1850s, it was showing up in the three cultures that were neighboring, right? And they'd call that diffusion of innovation. There was only one independent innovation. They came up with the type of pottery in one culture, and then it was borrowed by the ones neighboring. Right? So there was one independent innovation, multiple diffusions. Right? So independent innovation is much less common than diffusion of innovation. Right? That's culture change. All right. Remember Franz Boas, and everybody probably has heard these terms before. Hang on. I got my animations mixed up here. Okay. Ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. I try to pair terms together whenever I can to help people remember them more easily. So I remember Boas. I remember that he was interested in salvage ethnography. He had a holistic approach to culture, came from the four fields, considered one of the founding figures in American anthropology, all that stuff. He is also closely associated with the concept of cultural relativism. And cultural relativism is a near opposite of ethnocentrism, which is a term that you probably all heard in some other class at some point. Ethnocentrism is the assumption that one's own culture is superior to the cultures of others. And that has inherently negative tones when you first encounter it. Now we're going to draw that into question a little bit because, as in so many other cases, things are not necessarily black and white. Ethnocentrism overtly sounds bad, assuming that your culture is better than others. Cultural relativism is the assumption that all cultures are equal and equally adaptive, which sounds, on the surface, sounds very good. And as I said, cultural relativism, as I was en route to saying, cultural relativism is closely associated with Franz Boas. Right? Assumption that all cultures are equal in a moral sense and equally adaptive, meaning they function equally well to allow people to survive in environments. Excuse me. All right, now I said that there are some gray areas in terms of how these work. One sounds good, one sounds bad. And you can obviously say ethnocentrism is bad. It can lead to persecution and genocide and all kinds of horrible things. That's absolutely true. If you look at history, it certainly has happened. Cultural relativism, you look at that and you say, oh, that sounds good. Assumption that everybody's equal and equally adaptive, and equal is good, and we like it, and sounds great. Now, either one of these can introduce bias into your research, however, and lead you to false conclusions. Right, so either one of them can be bad. Ethnocentrism as a general concept, I like to point out, sort of exists along a continuum, and sometimes we condemn it, and sometimes we don't. This is sort of my thinking on how the continuum runs. These are different things that are all sorts of ethnocentrism, valuing your own culture over other people's culture, but some of them seem progressively better to us on the left, and some of them seem progressively worse to us on the right on this particular chart. Resistance, which we've got circled in green to the left, right? That's something that most people look at and say, yeah, it's justified, it's reasonable. You got a small group of people, you got a larger group of people. A larger group of people maybe is imposing their culture on a smaller group of people, and the smaller group is resisting. They're trying to preserve their own culture in the face of this encroachment. That is ethnocentrism. They're assuming that their culture is better than the other one, so we want to keep it. We don't want it to be destroyed. And we largely lionize that. That is, we think that's good and we look up to it. Patriotism is usually what we call the ethnocentrism that is positive, has positive effects for your community. It's good if people have solidarity. They see themselves as part of one group and work together toward various goals. And patriotism facilitates that in many cases. Where we start to see a tipping point, and people start to think of it in terms of nationalism, which is a little bit more of a neutral term, and a little bit more strong than patriotism in terms of how people normally use it. Right. Nationalism, it can be a fervent patriotism and not necessarily bad, but it also can tip into persecution and run into something called genocide, which everybody's, I'm sure, heard of. You try to wipe out entire groups of people because they're different from you. Right. So there's definitely a bad side of ethnocentrism, and there's also the good side that often is completely ignored, although we embrace it pretty readily. Right. So what's the problem with? So that's how ethnocentrism is kind of a gray area. How's cultural relativism not completely obvious? If you assume that all cultures are equal and equally adaptive, and I ask people specifically to think about these terms in relation to the Napoleon Chagnon piece. Right? He went out, he was studying the Yanomamo, he's been fiercely criticized for his portrayal of the Yanomamo. Right? And we mentioned that, talked about it at length in class, probably on multiple days. I keep bringing that up as a reference because we read it and we can talk about it, right? So in that particular case, cultural relativism did cause him to arrive at a false, not necessarily a false conclusion, but probably a morally poor conclusion, if not strictly speaking, a scientifically poor conclusion. Right? He went in assuming that whatever behavior he found among the Yanomamo would be adaptive, meaning it would be something positive for their culture. Yet there were some practices there that were not necessarily adaptive. Some were maladaptive, and I'll leave you to sort that out in your own reading of the text. Right? Look for things like that, though. Look for ethnocentrism as well. I would say there are cases when ethnocentrism led him to the right conclusion and the wrong conclusion, because you can't eliminate ethnocentrism completely. The guy came from Cambridge, Mass, and moved into the Amazon. And he's going to bring some presuppositions from his own culture. He's going to bring some of the standards of his own culture with him. You can't just eliminate all that stuff. Right? And sometimes it helped him, sometimes it hurt him. Sometimes it led him to a poor conclusion. So look for those things. Cultural relativism, he was trained in anthropology, so he got the Boasian approach and understood cultural relativism. And that certainly influenced the way that he interpreted certain things. He seemed judgmental sometimes, but other times he didn't, maybe when he should have been. All right, so ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. We should know both of those terms and understand that both can introduce bias into research. All right, those are the major things I wanted to get through. These are just reminders of the readings. Right, the horse miner reading I made optional, and the Chagnon one is the one I was referencing, and that's Napoleon Chagnon down here with some people in the Yanomamo group that he was studying. All right, so read that if you have not read that, and that's the end of that section. This was a map that was in aid of the optional piece, so I'm not going to worry about that. All right, so we'll close it out there. So thank you very much.